Hello and welcome to the Just Culture Spotlight webinar series. This is the 8th in a series that we do every month. You can find previous episodes on our YouTube channel and they're accessible through the Just Culture Consulting website. I'm 𝗥𝗲𝘀𝘁𝗶𝘃𝗲, the founder and principal consultant at Just Culture Consulting. We work with organisations that are frustrated with their culture, people aren't speaking up, mistakes keep repeating, and leaders feel stuck. And we help them fix that in a way that's fair and actually helps them get better results. So for the purpose of this webinar series is to provide some information on various aspects of just culture and of safety management. It's an opportunity to ask just culture related questions, whether it's very basic all the way up to the very advanced. This webinar, we are discussing restorative just culture. Now, the idea of restorative just culture has been advocated by Sidney Dekker, who's academic in Queensland. He's very involved in this area. And he explains the restorative just culture as an approach that aims to restore trust and relationships after an incident. So it looks for parties to collaborate and repair harm that's occurred. So by its very nature, it is a lot more relational and human than the classic just culture approach that was originally developed by James Reason and others, which tends to be a bit more transactional between the individual and the organisation. So in terms of the format for today, I'll speak for around 20 to 25 minutes. I'll talk about what is restorative justice itself, what is restorative just culture, how it works, its strengths. I'll talk about its weaknesses, and then we'll have 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. But do please feel free to post your questions at any time during this webinar. And and I'll try and keep an eye on the chat and answer them if we go. If I don't get to your questions as we go, I'll be happy to answer those at the end. In addition to questions, if you have any suggestions that you'd like us to cover on future webinars, or if you have any unrelated just culture, safety management, human factors type questions, please, you can also go to put those in the chat or go to www.justculture.com.au/askquestions, and any question that you put there, we will take a look at and provide an answer. All right, so let's dive in now that we've got the preliminaries out of the way. What is restorative justice, firstly? So restorative justice as we know it today began in response to relatively minor crimes, often property crimes, such as burglary in the 1970s. And it was an alternative to a normal criminal prosecution. Having said that, you can find similar examples of similar ideas going back hundreds of years. But when we're talking about the modern incarnation of just culture, that's of restorative justice, that tends to be where it sort of started. And so the classic example might be, say you've got a situation where a person shoplifts from a store, and they've gotten caught. And so rather than going through a traditional criminal prosecution, in a restorative justice process, the shoplifter might meet in a facilitated conversation with the shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper gives their account about how they have been impacted by what the person did, and the person who did the shoplifting gives their account of what they did. And ideally, that person would also express genuine regret, apologize for the harm caused, and then both of them would have a facilitated conversation, so with the neutral party, about how things could be put right. So, and there are many different ways in which that could go and be resolved. Maybe the person agrees to stay away from the shop. Maybe on the other hand, the person does some volunteer work at the shop. Maybe it's just simply an apology and that's the end of the matter. But what the outcome is really does depend on that facilitated conversation around what is required to repair the harm and damage that has been caused. Probably the most prominent example at a large scale of restorative justice in modern times was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in post-apartheid South Africa. As part of that process, restorative just culture was defined as a process where all stakeholders affected by an injustice have an opportunity to discuss how they have been affected by the injustice and to decide what should be done to repair the harm. So that telling of stories, of being able to express how they've been affected by an injustice is really something that's really central to the restorative justice process. And essentially, it's an idea of justice that rather than treating people as based on what they deserve, so you did X, which merits Y response, restorative justice is more about restoring relationships that have been damaged or broken as a result of some unjust harm. So a restorative just culture is about bringing these ideas of restorative justice into the workplace, and it's about how can we treat people within the workplace, how can we respond when things go wrong in a way that is going to help restore relationships and trust after things have gone wrong. So how does a restorative just culture work, and what are its strengths? So I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint here. So as I previously mentioned, it was developed primarily by Sidney Dekker, drawing from restorative justice concepts developed in the 1970s. Unlike a traditional or classic James Reason style just culture, there's no flowchart as such. It's more about a general approach rather than necessarily a step-by-step process. But it has three primary guiding questions. The first is, who is hurt? So something has gone wrong, and there has been harm or damage that's been caused. Well, who has suffered that harm or damage? So you're trying to identify all of the people who have been impacted as a result. You're then asking, what do they need? So based on the harm, the damage that has been caused, and the people who have suffered that harm or damage, what do they need to be able to repair and that harm or damage, to restore trust? And that's going to look different for each person. And then the third is, whose obligation is it to meet that need? So the idea being that as each person has needs for restoration, depending on who that person is, different other people will have different obligations in order to meet those needs. So I'll talk a little bit about how that sort of plays out. But essentially, it has, when you are conceptualizing a restorative just culture approach, there's some terms that are probably worth defining. The first is what's called a first victim, and then maybe multiple first victims, but that is the people who have been harmed directly by the thing that has gone wrong, the mistake that has been made. So let's use the example of a hospital. A patient has undergone surgery, and there's been a mistake during the surgery, and as a result, the patient has suffered some sort of injury, or their condition has been made worse, or something like that. So in this case, the patient is the first victim. They're the ones who have suffered harm. Also, potentially their relatives and family may also be first victims as well. Then you have second victims, and the second victims are the people who, the person or people who have made the mistake, who have probably unintentionally caused the harm or damage. So in this particular example, it's maybe the surgical team. The surgical team made a mistake during the surgery, and they're called second victims because they themselves, by even inadvertently inflicting harm on a patient, are potentially harmed themselves because they might be suffering from shame, from guilt about what has happened. And so they also have needs that need to be addressed. The organisation, so in this case the hospital, has needs as well. It has been harmed. Obviously, there might be reputational damage. There might be potentially requirements for compensation from the patients and so on. And then looking wider, you've got the community and regulators. They need confidence in this case the healthcare system, and that there is going to be accountability for mistakes, that mistakes are going to be fixed, that systems are going to be improved. On that topic of accountability, one of the central differences of a restorative just culture is that it redefines accountability. Rather than accountability being an account that you settle, so that you do something wrong and you're kind of in debt and you need to pay your debt, as it were, it's redefined from an account that you settle to a story that you tell. So you give your account. And so everyone in the restorative just culture process is accountable in that process by giving their account of what has happened and how they have been affected by it. And that is the central form of accountability in a restorative just culture, which naturally is therefore a more forward-looking accountability. It is talking about, yes, what has happened, but how have they been affected and what do they need going forward in the future. And so this means that the process is much less likely to enter a blame type space where you're working, who was responsible and who needs to pay. Rather, it's about looking forward, who's been hurt and what do they need. By its very nature, then, a restorative just culture will cover more stakeholders than a classic just culture approach. A classic just culture approach tends to be limited to the individual who made the mistake and the organisation that they work for. Whereas a restorative just culture just naturally takes a wider view. It embraces the person who has suffered the harm in the first instance, so the patient or the passenger or whoever it might be. But it will cover everyone who's been affected, a whole range of stakeholders, as I mentioned before, perhaps regulators, the community in general, the organisation. So it, which is really, really important if you are going to have a holistic response when something goes wrong. It also embraces a wider range of narratives. It is less about defining a single narrative of what happened. It is about embracing that everyone comes to these situations with their own narratives, their own story to tell, and that again, because the focus is on what people need to restore trust and relationships and repair harm, it's less about disentangling those narratives and defining which is the quote unquote true narrative, which often is an impossible task in any event, because there will always be different perspectives around an event. If there is a facilitated discussion around what is needed to address the injustice, to repair the harms and damage, to restore relationships, then it's more likely that the outcomes are going to be felt as fair and just of the people involved, because it's all about meeting those people's needs. Now, you're not always going to be able to obtain agreement on what is needed. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, but you're much more likely to be able to if that's your focus. There's also a strong emphasis on openness and truth-telling. Again, because the focus is less about who is responsible, it is more about, say again, who's been harmed and what do they need. And that emphasis on restoring trust and relationships can be very good for helping to address interpersonal conflicts as well, where people often will have different narratives about what's going on in a situation. So to give you an example of a restorative justice process, what that might, how you would sort of analyse a situation with restorative just culture. There was an incident a few years ago in the air traffic control unit at Cairns Approach. An air traffic controller was on duty during a very quiet shift. There were no aircraft that were scheduled to fly in his airspace during that shift. So it was very, very quiet. It was overnight. And he was found lying across two chairs with a blanket over him. He'd fallen asleep. He hadn't intended to fall asleep, but he had. And in analysing what happened, there were both personal factors and what you might say system factors that were involved in why this incident occurred. In terms of the personal factors first, he was lying across two chairs, so in a more sedate, comfortable position, not moving. He was not undertaking activities to maintain his mental alertness. So he was not doing all the things that he could have been doing to avoid falling asleep. He was putting himself in a situation where sleep was more likely. So there were definite areas of things personal to him. But then there are also a bunch of system factors that were present as well that made this event more likely. The first was that the air conditioning in the air traffic control room could not be adjusted. So the room was cold at night. And so staff would regularly use blankets during the night shifts because it was cold. The fact that it was a night shift with very low workload, he just had very little to do. He'd just be, for the most of the part, he would just be sitting there. And so there's very low levels of stimulation. And concentrating in that kind of environment and staying focused is difficult, where there's nothing happening, there's nothing to do. He'd also had a roster pattern with multiple consecutive night shifts due to low staffing levels. So there was a fatigue element there as well because of that roster pattern. So that if we analyse then this through a first victim, second victim, organisation and community lens, first victim, well, nil. No aircraft flew through his airspace during the time that he was asleep. So there's no direct first victim, but there might have been. The second victim is the controller himself, and he's going to have needs. He needs compassion because there's likely that he would have been suffering from shame, worry about his job, and whether what's going to happen to him now. Is he going to get fired, and so on. So he has needs. The organisation has needs. So the air traffic control organisation, it needs information. It needs to understand what happened and why it happened. It has needs for reputational repair because this does not look good to outsiders. And then the community has needs. It needs information about what happened. It needs reassurance that that things are going to be done to make sure that this does not happen again. So when we then turn to, okay, who's got obligations to meet those needs? In this case, the second victim, the controller, has an obligation to be willing to tell his story truthfully, to express remorse, to contribute to the learning process. The organisation has obligations. It needs to be willing to participate and be willing to look at the systemic issues. It has obligations to offer help to their employee, the controller, to be accountable for improving their systems to ensure that this sort of thing does not happen again. The community too has obligations to be willing to participate in restorative processes and to be understanding of human weaknesses. So a restorative just culture really does offer a lot in terms of helping organisations responses be more compassionate and human. And that's something that is very, very welcome. Sometimes a classic just culture response can sometimes be quite mechanical and policy driven and not really take into account the individual humans who are involved in that process. Having said that, the restorative just culture also has some weaknesses to it. That idea of forward-looking accountability isn't necessarily always the most suitable approach in some instances. How it can struggle a little bit when responding to some of the extremes that we see, such as criminal or reckless behaviour. If you have someone who is engaging in malicious conduct or grossly reckless conduct, a restorative just culture approach can struggle a little bit because it may well be that the organisation's need is basically to exit the person from this organisation, and that can be difficult to do in a restorative kind of process where we say, well, we're going to restore you to the organisation by exiting you from it. Not saying that you can't, but it is, but conceptually it's a little bit difficult because you're not actually, in this case, restoring them. If you have situations where people are not fulfilling their professional responsibility, such as a surgeon putting people at risk, again, that can cause issues where you need to ensure that the safety of people who could be impacted. So there are some challenges there in dealing with those sort of more extreme kind of cases. Restorative just culture can also struggle where no harm has been caused, but a risk of harm has been created. So, for example, a person driving at grossly excessive speed on the road, and they don't have an accident, there's no harm or damage as such. Now, you can certainly argue that the community as a whole has been harmed by being exposed to risk, but it is very abstract. And of course, most workplaces would hope to intervene in situations where risk of harm has been created before any real harm actual harm has occurred. It can also be difficult in recognizing and learning from exceptional performance or outcomes, because again, no harm or damage may have occurred. Also, at the end of the day, it's hard sometimes to get away from the fact that organizations still may need to judge competing narratives, because what is going to be considered necessary to repair the harm will naturally be influenced by what is believed to have occurred. So if I trip over and accidentally hit someone with my fist versus if I intentionally punch someone. Now, anger management counseling would be inappropriate where the contact was due to me tripping over and losing my footing, whereas it would be if I got angry and punched someone. So the organisation is still someone's going to have to judge between competing narratives in terms of crafting responses. A restorative just culture has less emphasis on maintaining accountability and on organisational learning. it's still there. It doesn't mean that it's not. It's more of a shift in emphasis. So if your real goal of a just culture is really about that organizational learning aspect, then a restorative just culture approach may not be a complete solution for you. Implementation of a restorative just culture can also be complex and resource intensive because you need well-trained people to be able to run those processes. It can also sometimes struggle to obtain acceptance from regulators and the public, because often the public and regulators are expecting people to be held accountable in that traditional sense. And if you are going to take a different pathway to that, then that is something that you're going to have to think about, of how you are going to obtain acceptance from regulators and the public, so that so confidence is maintained within your organization. There are ways you can do that, but it's something that you do need to think about. So to sort of to conclude then, I think there is a lot of merit in the restorative just culture approach. It works well in getting away from inquisitorial style investigations into much more collaborative style responses to events, such as learning teams and things like that. It works well in care type environments, such as healthcare, aged care, so industries like that, where most of the things that go wrong and the mistakes that get made are when people are trying their best, but something has not gone to plan. But is it a complete solution? I think it's because of some of the weaknesses that it has that I've spoken about. I think the answer is no. I think restorative processes are a really important thing to bring into your just culture processes. I think to make them more human and to take into account the individuals involved. And restoring trust and relationships is very important. But I think it needs to be part of a wider approach that also emphasizes organizational learning in particular. So is there a way that we can bring these approaches together? Yes, I think there is, and we'll cover this in our next webinar. All right, so that's all the things I wanted to talk about today as far as restorative just culture. There's a lot more that could be said about it, but we're limited on time. If you do have any more questions about restorative just culture, then please do put them in the chat, or say you can go to www.justculture.com.au/askquestions and anytime and put your questions there as well. All right. I'll use the remaining time to see to cover off. I see there's one question there in the chat. How is restorative just culture different from a traditional just culture investigation? Yeah, that's a really good question. So different models will emphasize different things. But broadly speaking, most just culture approaches are trying to understand what happened, why it made sense to people at the time, what were the system factors that contributed, and based on all that sort of holistic view, what organizational response is appropriate. As I mentioned before, a restorative just culture relies heavily on people giving their accounts of what happened and doing so in a shared way to sort of foster that mutual understanding. Whereas the traditional just culture model can become quite transactional in a way. It's much more focused on one individual and the organization. We analyze the event, we classify the person's behavior, decide the response, and move on. Whereas restorative processes remind us that these incidents, they affect real people, and there are a whole bunch of stakeholders that should be a part of that process: distressed, injured parties, distressed workers, families, managers, communities, and regulators. That said, where I think we need to be careful is assuming that restoration replaces all other forms of accountability. The organisation still needs to learn, it still needs to manage risks, and it still sometimes needs to make difficult decisions. But definitely, restorative approaches adds a lot into that process. So primarily the biggest difference, like I say, is that widening of the stakeholders involved, and that forward-looking as opposed to backward-looking. All right, let's see if there's any other questions here in the chat. How do you balance the needs of different stakeholders when their expectations conflict? Yeah, and this is one of the hardest challenges for any approach, not just the restorative just culture model. And it goes back to what I was saying a moment ago, which is that in most incidences, there isn't a single stakeholder. You have the worker who was involved, but you've also got supervisors, co-workers, customers, families, organizations, the community, and sometimes even regulators. And all of their needs, as we saw with the examples that we showed, those needs can be quite different. So the employee may need support and give an opportunity to rebuild trust. The organization may need to demonstrate its ability to learn from the event and to make systemic change. The community might want reassurance that the risks that have been exposed have been addressed. And I think in my experience, one mistake that organizations can make is that assuming that, well, fairness means that everyone gets what they want. But unfortunately, that is rarely possible. Fairness is more about ensuring all the relevant voices are heard and considered, and that there is that shared discussion around what is needed to repair the harm and the damage. And now, sometimes you can reach a point of agreement on those outcomes. Sometimes you can't. I also think it's really important that that there is transparency. If an organisation explains what it's considered, who it's talked to, whose interests were involved, and why it's gone down the path that it has, then people are much more likely to be accepting of the outcome, even if they don't fully agree with it, because they feel like they have been heard and what they've said has been meaningfully considered and they've been a part of that discussion. And one thing I really like about the restorative thinking is it explicitly broadens the conversation beyond the organisation and the individual. But as I say, sometimes someone ultimately has to make decisions around competing interests and competing narratives. All right, I think that's. Let's check if there's any other. Oh yeah, one more. All right, we'll do one more question, then we'll finish up for the day. How does restorative just culture align with legal, regulatory, or disciplinary obligations where an organisation is required to take formal action? Yeah, this is a really important practical question, this one. So obviously, a restorative approach doesn't exempt an organisation from its legal obligations. If legislation, regulations, or professional registration requirements, or employment law, or other things, if they require certain actions, then those obligations still exist. So, for example, if a licensed professional has acted against their professional standards, whatever the reason why, and there are mandatory reporting requirements, then a restorative process doesn't make that obligation disappear. It still needs to be reported. But what I would say is that even if there are formal accountability mechanisms that have to be followed, it doesn't mean that restorative principles can have no role. The way, particularly if those formal accountability mechanisms are external to the organisation, the way that the organisation itself conducts itself can still be restorative. The organisation can still treat people with dignity. It can seek openness rather than defensiveness. It can still consider the needs of all stakeholders and support people affected by an event. It can still focus on learning and prevention and that idea of forward accountability. So, I think it's less about, do we go restorative or accountability? It's more about, can we bring restoration into a process that may already contain accountability requirements? So I think restoration is something that is really, really important to humanize a process, but it also is not a complete replacement for other forms of accountability, particularly once you move into highly regulated industries. Significant harm events, reckless conduct, criminal matters, all of those have to be accounted for. A restorative process can't replace all of that, unfortunately. And so that's where I think it's really clear to be up front and with your staff about expectations, about where and how the organisation will utilise restorative processes, and where and how formal accountability processes will be used, so that people aren't surprised, and you're not making promises that you can't keep. I think, being upfront and clear with staff about so that they have confidence about what is going to happen in different circumstances, I think is really important for building and maintaining trust. All right, we've gone a little bit over time, thank you for sticking around. Those of you who have stuck around, thank you very much, everyone, for joining and those great questions. I hope you found this webinar helpful. The next webinar, as I mentioned, will be about how you might be able to bring restorative processes in and link up with other parts of Just Culture to perhaps a bit more of a complete solution. So be on the lookout via LinkedIn and YouTube for that. It will probably be in late September. Again, if you have any questions or suggestions for a future webinar, please do go to the website www.justculture.com.au/askquestions. Or if you have any specific Just Culture related questions that you'd like an individual answer to, then you can ask those there as well. All right. Hope you have a fantastic rest of your week, and hope to see you next time. Thanks very much.